in case you can only hear me now, welcome. I'm introducing Robin Morris, our new energy convener, who's got a wonderful background in a whole raft of technical areas. Yeah, Robin and I met through Energy Local, where we did some pioneering work of integrating renewables. Sort of pioneering the sort of work that Project Leo is doing now. And Robin was also a director at Moixa, one of those early battery storage technologies. And now Robin is working on materials based in the Department of Materials for a hydrogen economy. So again, we have some various bits of overlap there. So you can tell he's got the sort of breadth and background to lead an illustrious network like the Oxford Energy Network. And I'm excited and delighted that Robin has taken on this role and that he'll now be able to introduce our new speakers for a new series of talks in person. Thank you. Welcome, Robin.
Phil, thank you very much indeed. And I didn't want to take any time on that, but I appreciate all the work you've done for the Energy Network over the last year or so. And actually, we first met when you were at Imperial College looking at liquid air as an energy storage medium. So it goes back further than you imagine. Anyway, let's move on to the main topic today. This was work that came out in April, and we leapt into action as quickly as we could, which means it's now October. But frankly, we had the summer where we couldn't run a seminar series. And we're delighted to invite 3 people to come and speak and do a triple act today, all based at the Oxford Martin School. And what fascinated me most of all about Doyne Farmer was not his external professor position at Santa Fe Institute, but actually looking at some of the work he's done on complex systems and digital computers to predict the game of roulette. And I wondered if that could be applied to wholesale gas prices these days to try and help keep ahead of the game. Maybe it's fixed and the odds are in favour of the house in that case. The second person we're going to hear from Rupert, who is a postdoctoral researcher in that programme. And Rupert has a PhD in maths, but has an interest in physics, so I think that sounds very positive. Sorry if that theme keeps dropping up. And Matthew Ives, forming the end of the three-way act, an economist, and again looking at the post-carbon transition. And I think the timing of this talk is absolutely right, because informing COP26 to say we can deliver net zero in an economic and a feasible manner within a sensible timescale is the kind of message we're trying to communicate outside. And I'm really fascinated to hear more about it myself. So please welcome Doyne onto the stage, and let's hear more about a new perspective on decarbonising the global energy system.
Let me see. So this gives an over. Let me actually first say what a pleasure it is to give a talk in person. This is the first time I've spoken in person in about 1.5 years, and I'm really looking forward to having some faces in the audience rather than just looking at a screen. Hi to you guys out there in Zoom land too. And by the way, if you're in the room, just feel free to, if you have a clarifying question, just ask it, okay? This will be a tag team. We're kind of 15 minutes each. We're hoping to get our presentation done in 45 minutes so that you can pepper us with lots of questions at the end and we can have a lively discussion. So please think about your more substantive questions that you want to save. So this is the overview. We're going to go over what decision makers are being told, what's wrong with the story, is there a better perspective, what's the cost, and say a few more things. Now, suppose you're a decision maker and you're trying to decide what to do about climate change. You would go to the experts like the IPCC, and they would present you with a bunch of scenarios like the ones shown here. And, mostly what you see or you hear when you listen to economists is that stopping climate change will be slow or very expensive. That is, unless if we stay up here, it's cheaper, and if we go down here, it's more expensive, and the harder we go down here and the more quickly we go down here, the more expensive it gets. We are going to try and convince you that that's wrong. Okay, sorry, I didn't realize I had all these things popping up. Okay, I'm going to ignore them because I want to finish this on time. Now, if you look at the models that most of the IPCC reports are based on, they're called integrated assessment models. There's also models by the International Energy Association. And what kind of track record? It's now been a while since they've been making forecasts. And so we've sort of seen what's happened in the meantime. And so if you take, say, as an example, technology, solar photovoltaics, and you look at the forecasts that have been made, we show forecasts by the IEA here. We show forecasts by the integrated assessment models in blue. And we can look back to projections reported in 2014 for what improvement solar PV was going to make over until present. And what you see is that the forecasts, the rate of progress for those forecasts, we looked at 2,503, as I recall, something like that, 2,803 maybe it was. But this is the histogram of those forecasts. None of them were even close to what actually happened. So there's been something wrong. And part of what I want to stress here is that if you're trying to estimate what climate change abatement will cost us, mitigation will cost us, the assumptions about technological progress are the things that dominate those estimates. So they've gotten things dramatically wrong, and they continue to get them wrong. If you look at the forecasts now, none of the forecasts are forecasting rates of improvement as high as the ones we've been seeing for the last 30 years. Over here, we show one of the problems. These models tend to assume something called floor costs. That is, they assume there's some magical cost out there that things just can't go lower than that because it's kind of inconceivable. How do they get these floor costs? Well, they make them up. So there's no historical evidence that we found that floor costs exist. And what we show here is on the left slide, you see floor costs that have been postulated at different points in time, and you see the prices of solar PV breaking through the floor costs again and again. So again, something's wrong. Now, is there a better perspective? Well, let's take a step back and look at what's happened over the global energy landscape for the last century and a half. And so we show that data here. I think we're the first to collect all this data and show it in one place. And when you look at this picture, these pictures, you see some interesting things. In particular, you can see that fossil fuels, oil, coal, gas, they fluctuate around, but they stayed at roughly the same price for a century and a half. They haven't really changed very much in cost. In contrast, other technologies like solar PV have been dropping at the order of 10% per year. And we're at a unique point in history right now because there's a lot of competing technologies, all in this nexus, in this part of the curve, all at around the cost of 100 megawatts per kilowatt hour. Now, if you look at the other plot, you again see something interesting. That is, you see over time, the increase in fossil fuels, and you see how, you can see nuclear power shooting up and then flattening out. And then you see, on the right, you see solar, batteries, wind, and PX fuel all shooting up at rates that are dramatically different from the other ones, the order of 40% per year. And so the combination of the fact that the costs of those technologies have been plummeting and the deployment of those technologies has been skyrocketing, although they might still be a few percent. If you think in exponential terms, it's only the order of a decade before they should be up there above the other ones. Now, so that suggests that those technologies are special and that something different, that the energy landscape may do something very different than what it's ever done before. So how are we going to make this into a more rigorous statement? Well, to begin with, for the last, I don't know, 12 years or more, I've been looking at 15 years now, been looking at technological progress, because I realized back then, this is really the key to understanding climate change. And we have to have some more rigorous way to make forecasts about what things are going to do in the future. So the first thing I want to point out that comes from collecting a lot of data is that rates of technological progress are highly heterogeneous. Again, if you look at the slide, you'll see that most technologies, so we're plotting progress rates on the x-axis, measured in percent per year. So a negative number means faster progress because the price of the technology is dropping. These prices are from I now forget what it's a U.S. manufacturing index from one of the U.S. government agencies. And so they make some adjustments based on quality. But you see that most things, if you look, are in that bell-shaped curve off on the right. They aren't making very fast progress. But there's some technologies, some categories of things, in this case, they all happen to be associated with computers or semiconductors, that are off on the tail. Now, those aren't the only things that are making rapid progress. They're just the only things that are produced at a big enough scale to enter the government statistics. There's other technologies that are making progress at rates of 30% per year, even 40% per year. So, but you see a heavily a skewed long-tail distribution. The message is not all technologies are the same. There's some small category of special technologies that make much faster progress than the other ones. And the reasons for that are a bit mysterious. So I can comment on that at the end. Here's another picture comparing different technologies or different goods, because I don't know if you want to call hospital services or college tuition and fees a technology, but different things that we pay for. And over a 20-year span, so the x-axis shows 20 years, and we look at starting in 1990, how the price changed to get to 1998, how the price changed leading up to 2018. And you can see on one hand, you have things like hospital services that increased by 225% in the US, college tuition and fees that increased by about 180%. And then you have television sets that dropped so that television by 95%, meaning a television set that you bought in 2018 was a factor of 20 cheaper than the equivalent television set 20 years before. The key thing that's not on the other slide that I want you to notice is the persistence. Television sets dropped in every year, and college tuition went up every year. These patterns are very persistent. Okay, now how do we take advantage of that? Well, one of the most famous ways of forecasting a technology is Moore's Law, originally thought to apply only to semiconductors, but we now know versions of Moore's Law apply to lots of things. There's another actually older law than Moore's Law called Wright's Law, dates from 1936, that says that when you take a given, he originally just made this statement for airplanes, you take a given kind of airplane produced in a given factory, the cost of producing that airplane would drop by 20% every time you double production, the cumulative production of that airplane. And this Wright's Law has now been used to think about what's going on for hundreds of technologies. We collected data on 50 different technologies, everything we could lay our hands on. And here you can compare Moore's Law and Wright's Law for 4 representative technologies, transistors, photovoltaics, hard disk drives, and ethanol. And you can see that actually they both do about the same. The difference is that when we think about Moore's Law, we're plotting the logarithm of cost against time. And when we think about Wright's Law, we're plotting the logarithm of cost against the logarithm of cumulative production. Now, we've done a lot of thinking about which of these is better. For most forecasting exercises, they do about the same, but there's a central problem here of cause and effect. That is, are we seeing costs drop because we have higher production? Or are we seeing higher production because higher production lowers cost. Or I think I said that backwards. Yeah, the lower cost causes higher production because if you lower costs, then things get cheaper and so demand goes up. Or do you lower costs because you do higher production and you have economies of scale, or you learn and you drive costs down. So it's hard to find good places where you can tease that out. It's surely a combination of both. It's a feedback loop between the two. But to assess the extent to which higher production caused costs to drop, we looked at data from World War II, where, you know, the United States is kind of hard to believe, but in 1939, the United States had the 18th largest military in the world. And by the end of the war, they had produced 2/3 of the military equipment for both sides combined. So, and then they ramped way back down from there. So you have a kind of unique case. And we know that it wasn't that, you know, Roosevelt said, gosh, tanks are getting cheap, let's buy a lot of them. He said, you know, he went on record as saying, we will produce whatever we need to produce, no matter what it costs. And so analyzing this data, we analyzed hundreds of technologies from World War II. We found that cumulative production explains about half of the drop. The others explained by an overall trend. Now, this led us to develop a method for making forecasts in a systematic way. We reformulate Wright's Law as a time series model so that we can apply it in a very systematic way, and we can take into account the fact that forecasts are never certain. So we have a noise term in the model, and we can estimate the size of that noise term based on the historical data. And so we did this. For a lot of different technologies, we pretend to be at a given time in the past. We forecast each future date. We repeat that for all past dates. We score the methods based on their forecasting errors. We assume the underlying process is the same for all technologies, so we can test the underlying process on lots of different technologies. Although the parameters, we fit 2 parameters for each technology, and so there's happening here, and we tested this on 50 different technologies. We made 6,000 forecasts on 50 different technologies. So we had 6,000 tests, not completely independent, but fairly independent for Wright's Law. And we actually had an a priori hypothesis about how good the forecast should be. So we didn't just test the quality of the forecast, we actually tested our formula for forecasting the quality of the forecast and the distributional forecast that we were making. And it survived the test, the statistical test that we made. Now, so this is, for example, a distributional forecast of solar PV. This is assuming business as usual, that is, assuming the costs continue to drop at the rate they're dropping already, or that we have a deployment rate. Oh, sorry, no, we did not assume that at all. We assumed that we have a deployment rate that is consistent with the way costs have been dropping. And then you see our probabilistic forecast where the solid black area is the 1 standard deviation range, the gray area is the 2 standard deviation range. And so you see the forecast we made back in 2016. By the way, I made a forecast in Nature in 2010. This was in the context of debate about nuclear power, where we were pointing out that we don't really need nuclear because solar PV is going to be competitive. We forecast it would be competitive. And by the way, you can see the bullshit that others were saying at the time, the economists saying for projects with low cost financing that tap high quality resources, solar PV is now the cheapest source of electricity in history, after saying, oh, sorry, I had it backwards. This is the International Energy Agency. In 2014, the economists said solar power is by far the most expensive way to reduce carbon emissions. So we've gone from that statement in 2014 to this statement by the IEA in 2020. In those 6 years, according to the forecast, I mean, we actually were still too pessimistic. It exceeded what we predicted. And here we see our original probabilistic forecast on the right. You see the Hinkley Point reactor proposed Hinkley Point reactor price as that cross, that red cross on the left, and you see coal and nuclear power just for reference on the same slide. Now I'm running over time, but I think that's the next wrestler will take the tag team.
Okay, so we've got an idea how to make forecasts for single technologies, which we believe is more reliable than methods other people have used in the past. So for we didn't quite hit that, but so for technologies which develop like PV, we're going to use this Wrights Law formulation. But for the fossil fuel-based type technologies, we're going to use an autoregressive 1 type model, which is this kind of thing, where the past data is all stay roughly the same, and we're going to make a stochastic forecast for prices and costs in the future. So the big question then is, how do we combine these forecasts, these two different types of forecasts for all the different technologies to say something about the whole energy system? So we need a system model for that. We have to have lots of text together and have them in suitable quantities, which we're going to call a scenario. Fine. So the key features of our forecasts to note are that we make data intensive forecasts. So we need a lot of data in the past to make our forecasts. We are probabilistically forecasting the costs, and our technology, our PV-like technologies, the non-fossil fuel ones, are scenario dependent. So here you see how in a couple of different scenarios, the more we produce, like in the green scenario, the further we're going to drive the cost down the experience curve in our forecasts. So these properties here lead to a very different design of the model than other energy system models. So this is our philosophy that we started out with. We need a model that's very simple to understand and communicate. We need to have it as closely tied to data as possible, because we need to update it regularly with new data, because these technologies are moving so fast. Ideally, we'd like it to be quick to run so that we can do lots of testing and experiment with different scenarios, etc. But then the most important things really are that we need to represent as much of the system as we can with as few technologies as possible. And we want to faithfully represent all the kind of technology dynamics that we've seen are missing out from other models. These hopefully lead it to be reliable and trustworthy, which are things which have been missing in some other models. So in contrast to our philosophy, this is an integrated assessment model called IMAGE. On the left, we see the entire system map, and the top right-hand corner is the energy system. And if you blow it up, then you'll find all these lovely things like preferences, lifestyle parameters, loads of other stuff in there. What else is there? And on the taxes, air pollution, trade restrictions, etc. And on the left, the rest of the model here is made up of the economy, labour, capital, elasticities, agriculture, livestock, forestry, urbanization, a whole load of stuff. So we need to start from the point of what data exists. And here we find some of the data that Doyne was just talking about. We've got around 100 years of data for oil, coal, and gas. Gas and coal electricity, nuclear power, they're all a bit more recent, so we've only got around 40 years of data on those. Hydro, bio, we couldn't find too much data on those, and same for the PV, wind, lithium-ion batteries, PEM electrolyzers. We do have around 10 to 50 years of data on these, and the cost trends and the models that we're going to use are listed up there. So note that these are all global costs, and that we have also global production data, for these. And that's kind of one of the features of the model, is we're very aggregated. So we have huge chunks like all of PV. We don't break stuff down into different categories of PV, or even wind. We just take wind as a whole. We don't break it down into offshore and onshore. Limited data is on all these other texts at the bottom, like CCS, biofuels, traditional biomass, heat, pump storage, marine, blah, blah. There's also quite limited data on flow batteries and electricity networks, but I've put them in italics here because we're going to actually use them in the model, despite the limited data. So how do we include which technologies we're going to have? Well, these are our main criteria: data availability, system coverage, so we need to cover as much of the system as possible, and the system dynamics. We want fast-moving techs. We need to keep those in the model because it's the basic criteria are we need things which are either big now or which have very big growth rates now, and those two things determine what goes in. And then this final category, which I've called flexibility and functionality. So these are all the other kind of system constraints that you need for storing, transporting energy and converting it between different energy carriers. So in red are the techs that are in the model. There's 14 of them: oil, coal, gas, raw, primary fuels, electricity from these major sources which already exist, wind and PV, the upcoming ones with very large growth rates, and for the flexibility techs, we've got two kinds of batteries, vanadium redox flow batteries, and we've got electrolyzers and electricity networks. And these all have very high, the batteries and electrolyzers have very high growth rates as well, so they're also in this category. We exclude all these little technologies at the bottom on the basis of them being either small or irrelevant, in the sense that they either have very small growth rates or they can be accounted for in some other way, like CCS with power, in power generation. There's always a lower bound on the cost of what that will be, which is unabated power generation from fossil fuels. So gas power with CCS is always going to be more expensive than straight gas power. So how do other models construct scenarios? They co-construct costs and deployment simultaneously, period by period. They say, we're going to produce this much of this tech, and it's going to have this cost at the end of it, and then they use that cost to work out how much they're going to produce in the next period, and they do that. So what they're essentially doing is actually forecasting both the cost and the production, which is probably much harder than just forecasting costs, which we're doing now. So yeah, so that leads to this thing where small errors early on can get magnified over time, leading to the scenarios that we're all very familiar with. So some use the endogenous technological learning, which is just Wright's Law learning curve or the experience curve, but they always do it deterministically with point forecasts, in contrast to our probabilistic model. They can be myopic, so they optimize just over period by period, or they can go for have much longer time horizons. Okay, so it's a mixed bag. It's very difficult to understand how that's going to be very reliable. We construct scenarios. Our key assumption is that, so first of all, we're going to introduce energy carriers and sectors of the economy, as well as the technologies. So the technologies are energy carriers, or they feed into them, they're used by them, and those get used in the economy in different sectors. Our key assumption is that total growth of energy services or useful energy grows at 2% consistently in all scenarios, and then we just grow or contract different combinations of technologies to meet that 2% growth, and we grow those based on what their historical growth rates are, and we allow historical growth rate to continue or to not continue. I'll give an example of that in a second. We have a few extra constraints, obviously, that we can't have a full electrification of everything. We require some fuels to be used. And then we also have, whenever we have variable renewable energy deployment, we also have, we have to match it by long and short-term storage of energy, which is either through batteries or electrolyzers, creating P2X fuels, which could be hydrogen or ammonia, etc. And we do that at some fixed percentage, so we grow solar and then we automatically grow batteries, that kind of thing. And a key point is that our scenarios are exogenous. We just construct them with no interaction between costs and deployment. This is what our system looks like, which is a lot simpler than the integrator's assessment model I just showed you, with our energy sources here, electricity, fuels, or fossil fuels, big intermediate sector where electricity is here, and we're feeding all of these in, we're creating P2X fuels, and we're using them, we're using electricity to make P2X fuels, which are either being used to back up electricity, to back up the power grid, or to go into the end-use sectors. So we're using hydrogen and ammonia in industry and transport. And we've got all these batteries and the electricity networks which have to be scaled up as this electricity sector scales up. So here are two examples of where we've got time, years in the future here, and production on a log scale here for lots of different energy technologies. If we just let the clean technology growth rates persist for another roughly 10 years, we see P2X is going to jump up, we see solar is going to carry on its curve, etc. And then you get to this mix, which I'll show you in a minute. And if we allow fossil fuel growth rates to persist for longer, then we just end up with everything being roughly the same. So the scenarios that we end up with this are, and I'll show you one intermediate one as well, these three here, which we call fast transition on the left, which is clean technology growth rates continue for around 10 years. No transition, which is fossil fuels continuing, and in between you've got a kind of moderate one. And so electricity system is on the bottom with showing the storage level of batteries with the purple line, and all the electricity that's being used for P2X fuels, for sectors and grid backup. And we're showing we're going to have, instead of this huge amount of fossil fuels, which is what we'll have if we just have everything continuing at the current proportions, we're lowering the final energy of that system, and we're just making more electricity. I mean, that's quite obvious. Yeah, so these are our three scenarios with the most important kind of transition dynamics, which is like, how fast are we going to do this? Not at all slowly or quickly. The forecasts that you get, now, if we now make up probabilistic conditional forecasts, conditional on those scenarios. This is the fast transition scenario forecast for solar and batteries. We're seeing that our forecast is way below the red lines, which are the forecasts that all the other IAMs or the International Energy Agency are using in their models. Yeah, solar batteries, there's a distinction between EV battery packs and consumer cells and grid scale batteries. We've taken all that into account, and these charts here show how you've got your no transition, the costs will be higher, and the cost forecast that we make are lower the faster you go. So, and here's a reminder that whilst we've got this interesting dynamics going on here, the fossil fuel forecasts are the same in all scenarios. It's just that straightforward forecast. So the question is, what are the results when you add up? Because we're going to add up all these forecasts for all the different technologies and get a big probability distribution for the net present cost of the scenarios. No surprise here, kind of a bit different order, but no transition, costs just keep increasing. Fast transition, you get over this hump as you drive down the costs of solar and wind in particular, and then it goes back up a bit as you start making all this P2X on a gigantic scale. But overall, the median costs of all the different technologies ends up being lowest in fast transition and but higher in slow transition and fast transition. But these are all probability distributions, so we've done it very carefully in a probabilistic way based on their on all the historical data. So what does the probability distribution as a whole look like? Well, so what we've got here is the expected value of the net present cost of each scenario relative to no transition. No transition is a baseline, which we've set to be 0 here. And we're showing that the net present cost of the scenarios, so that means you add up all the costs back to now with a varying discount rate, yields big savings for the fast transition and the slow transition. And that's the expected value of the distribution. That means it's a good bet to make.
At all discount rates.
At all discount rates. So yeah, in the past, a lot of work from other models has kind of concluded that there's some magical discount rate in the middle where, which could be around 3 or 5 or 7%, where if you include the future far enough, then it's wise to transition. But if you have a really high discount rate, or like 7% or something, or more, then you should just forget about it and you just assume that we'll fix it in the future. But we're saying that at all reasonable discount rates, it's still best to do a rapid transition, and yeah, the faster the better. So that's the headline result. There's a lot of subtleties. I put this slide in, but we can come back to it at the end, I think. So how do you choose technologies, sub-technologies, vintages, regional diversity of costs? What can't we predict? You know, what technologies might there be which are not in our list, which haven't even been invented yet? And let me tell you, we've thought of all of these, so it's just a list of things that we can discuss later. We've got all of our assumptions are consistently pessimistic about renewables and clean techs, and there's a whole load of new clean techs which are likely to come along and be much cheaper than even we've got in ours, such as structural batteries, hot rock storage, and grid-forming inverters being used on the power system and power electronics, etc. So now I will hand over to Matt. Let's read that slide.
I don't think that's one of my slides.
No.
Right. So finally, so Diane and Rupert, as you can probably tell, are responsible for most of the research you've seen here, a real work of love and pain. My involvement was to take this piece of work. I mean, you only know whether you've got real science and if you see the other side of the other point of view. And so I was involved at PI on a project where we took this work and we workshopped it with some of the leading experts. And so I'm just going to go through some of their main feedback on us, which did actually alter how we presented this. It didn't actually alter the results of what we did, but it did give us a bit of insight into what you might be thinking right now after having seen that presented. One piece, we were fortunate to have Frank Giels there, so I don't know if everyone's aware of the socio-technical transition approach. This is a fairly famous infographic, I'm told, where you take niche technologies such as solar and batteries that are introduced into your socio-technical regime, your current system. They combine at some point, some innovations fail.
At some point, you might have landscape components such as population change, regime shifts in governments, earthquakes, Fukushima, for instance, that can shake the foundations of the current regime to allow a niche technology in. There's quite a bit to this whole picture, which I won't go into, but one of the critiques that we got of the work that we're doing, and it's not just our work, it's actually the integrated assessment modelling community as a whole that they were critiquing, that they failed to accommodate the element vital to the understanding of the pace and cost of the transition towards a clean energy system. So their contention is that there's this complex web of technologies, infrastructures, organisations, markets, regulations and user practices that are required to deliver the energy transition in terms of heat, transport, energy to society, most of all the transition for any meaningful reduction in global emissions, which is a perfectly valid contention, and we're not disputing that. We don't actually say which one of these scenarios is the most likely. The fast transition does continue current trends, but what we're looking at is, well, what would be the cost if we did actually manage to pursue the current trends for the next 10 years? Another thing I would say is that our approach is actually closer to the socio-technical transition than arguably the integrated assessment models, which actually have gone to the trouble to try to model these barriers down to the scale of regional levels. And I'll talk about the critiques about our model not being regional. But that experience curve itself is, in some respects, a reflection of those barriers, those niche markets through time, successes as well as failures. Balsa wood, for instance, was in short supply at one period of time for wind energy. And that's there in the record and how we overcame that problem. So we're very good, actually, as someone that's been modelling these sort of complex systems for a while, at modelling those barriers. Not so good at modelling the human ingenuity, the ability to overcome these problems and to sidestep them. But the experience curve itself is the record of our ability to do that. So it's not a bad place to look for how well we can actually do that. That's the main idea with that, because we're running out of time. I won't go into too much more detail. The other critique we have is about, as I mentioned, regional differences. To what extent, given we've got a global energy system model, are we reflecting all the different prices in those various countries on Earth? This is the ARENA data on all the different installation costs for solar. So this doesn't include the increase in capacity utilisation of these technologies. It's not the experience curve, but it shows you that through time you've got this is the full range of all the regional differences, and through time it's coming down. What's most important here in terms of understanding those regional differences is the reason why we made a simplistic model, as Rupert said. One reason to do that and to avoid going into that problem of having to model all these different regional, how well connected a country is to another one that has different solar or wind resources and so forth. To simplify this problem is because we think the main process, the one that's really going to make the biggest difference, is technological progress. And so that's the one that we focus most on. But you can see here in the record that if we take the 95th percentile, so this varies from the 95th to the 5th percentile, that 95th percentile in 2019 is below the 5th percentile in 2010. So within 9 years, within 10 years, the technological progress has overcome all of those regional differences. So an important point to note. And then if we look at the individual countries associated with one of those years, you can see also that modular costs, the costs of the module that are only a small component of the overall cost of installing solar. There's those countries that are doing best, and they're the countries that have actually deployed the most, which I will show in the future. So you could argue that's because it's cost less, that's why they're deploying more. I'll contend that as well. But they're the ones that have actually brought down the cost of these other components, the soft costs, the financing costs, the installation costs, the grid connectivity costs. So that learning by doing is not just associated with the technology, it's associated with the deployment. That's the experience overall. Another thing in terms of, our post-carbon transition is about research, is about sensitive intervention points. And you can see, United States is around the mean level of that entire system. You've got some big economies whose costs of solar and wind are coming up with price parity with their cheapest source of fossil fuels. In this case, in the US, that's gas. In China, that is coal. So within the next 5 years, these countries are getting, if not already in some provinces and states, price parity with fossil fuels. That's not including batteries, the cost of batteries. That's just the individual technologies, but it's a disruptive technology, and you can see that happening right now in the US, in regional states, in India, in China, and that's just going to continue. If you've got costs coming down at 10% per year, that means they halve in 7 years. So in 7 years, we're going to have those costs half of what they are. So you can imagine how disruptive that will be. We do in individual regions, this is the solar potential across the planet, so looking at the technical potential of solar, we do in individual locations pick the best place, we tend to pick the best place to put these resources that are close to humans, so you probably wouldn't stick it way out in the middle of the desert in Australia, but we're not doing a very good job of actually taking into account where we have these resources. So, as I said before, it's not necessarily being deployed in places where it costs the least. There's vast ranges of the world where we're not installing that. This is all the countries that have the maximum amount of capacity of solar at the moment, and this is the case for wind. And these are the red markers are your high offshore wind resources. UK is getting there on the scale, but it's not there in terms of the amount of deployments that some of these other countries, which don't have nearly as much in terms of concentrated energy potential. So there's a vast room for improvement in terms of what we've done. Lastly, part of the project was actually to look at the emissions of this system, what it means in terms of comparison to the other models that are out there, like the integrated assessment models. Rupert didn't go into the details of it, but we don't model the entire energy system. There are components of, such as oil for electricity, biomass for cooking, that we don't include in the model for simplicity. So we've got our emissions that we can calculate based on what the models that Rupert has presented, the scenarios, and then we can take a bit of a guess into what it would mean in terms of the emissions of these other components that we didn't include. What you can see, this is the 1.9 RCP, which is compatible with the Paris Agreement, that if we are able to do this with the energy system, the fast transition, we are well within that range of the 1.5 degree scenarios, provided we are able to tackle all these other components, methane, land use changes and so forth. So provided we can tackle these other issues. The other thing is, well, I'll get to that. Lastly, Doyne went over this fairly quickly, so I'll give you the opportunity to go in a bit more detail. This is, as Doyne presented, what you're being told by the IPCC in terms of the fan of possibilities, which is fair enough. But what they're telling us based on their modelling is that to achieve this 2 degrees, less than 2 degrees, these scenarios have our economic growth reduced, the ones that get there more easily, or we reduce the energy use, there's demand management. We're not saying that's not a good idea. That'll actually make our scenario cheaper if we actually include demand management. We're not saying we don't need carbon capture and storage in our model, but the amount of carbon capture in storage in these models is quite staggering. It's the most ambitious one in terms of reducing our economic growth to reduce emissions. Requires us to build one of these carbon capture and storage plants every 3 days for the next 80 years. I mean, that seems far less doable than all the renewable deployment, given how simple it is comparatively to produce solar and wind and batteries. Also, because you're adding carbon capture and storage, that's a direct additional cost on top of the energy sources. So the electricity prices rise in that scenario. Look at how our story contrasts with it. So this is only the emissions of our scenario, but you can see us getting very quickly underneath their most ambitious scenarios, or most of them. But as Rupert pointed out, we don't reduce economic growth. We have useful energy rise the same in both these scenarios. They're both equivalent in terms of how much either economic growth or energy demand that they have in them. So we don't require any reduction. We don't add any carbon capture and storage. It could be a good idea to deploy this technology to deal with land use changes or road nations or whatever, but we don't use it to get this result. And electricity prices are 1/3 of business as usual. I mean, you can just imagine what that's going to do for sustainable development goals. I mean, in my mind, that solves about half of them, including, using your backstop measure like direct air capture with carbon capture and storage with such cheap electricity. So I don't know if you want me to just do the conclusions. This is the conclusions we came to after our workshop with the group, is that there's an opportunity to change this music that the decision makers are listening to at the moment, to one in which, if we continue this strong growth of these technologies over the next decade, this will put us on track to meet the Paris emissions reductions goals. It'll cost trillions less than the business as usual. It need not reduce economic prosperity, and it could make electricity much cheaper than everyone. That's a pretty good sell in my mind. So I'm interested to hear feedback on that. But we are trying to get this message to COP. It's part of the reason why we put that report out in April, even though the paper, which is a far better version of this story, is still in review in a journal. But this is the key point we want to get off at COP26. Thank you. The last thing, which is this is a part of a bigger economic modelling capability. It's only the first component that feeds into another that looks at things like the just transition and solutions in terms of industrial strategy to solve that, which is what Doyne's group in Complexity is working on at the moment. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know if we convinced the online audience or the audience here, but we've had a few questions come in online. I think representing Nick Ayer's interest here and picking up on one of the questions, in the transition, no transition using fossil fuel, there was more overall demand or production at the end, potentially in slide 33. We'll come back to look at that. But the broader question is, to what extent does the efficiency benefit get played out in this? If there's more work being done by electricity rather than transforming from a fossil fuel, to what extent do those get built into the outputs of the model? So the question online is about what happens in slide 33 to the back end of the fossil fuel scenario, but more generally, how is efficiency built in? So Matt, yeah, please.
Yeah, so we, the model's built in terms of useful energy growing, and the way it works is that we have a range of energy carriers, and we assume that the energy carriers, which are oil, coal, gas, electricity, and P2X fuels, they are converted at constant efficiencies to produce useful energy in each sector. So we are accounting for the much higher efficiency of electricity to provide useful energy generally. So in transport, that's the most one of the most interesting ones, where electricity can provide transport services at around 80% efficiency. So we produce the electricity in the model, and we assume that 80% of that electricity is converted into useful energy to make the transport services which the model is providing. In a scenario, so in the no transition scenario, we're using oil for transport, like we do today, which has an efficiency as an energy carrier of around 25% for providing transport services. So we have to produce 4 times as much, or use 4 times as much primary oil to get the same amount of transport services. So by keeping the useful energy of the whole system constant across all the different scenarios, we're seeing a lot more fossil fuels used as primary energy and final energy, even though the useful energies are the same. So yeah.
Go back to slide 34.
Yeah. So the right-hand end of that has a bigger total final energy.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have the useful energy slide here, but they are all, if you looked up the useful energy in the end-use sectors, the transport, buildings and industry, then they are all exactly constant.
Thank you very much. Can I take a question from the audience now, please? And I'm going to try and swing the camera around if that's all right. So I'm going to take a question from you first, and I can relay your question if you can't be heard. So please go ahead. Please, yes.
Sure. I was wondering how this model takes into account hard-to-abate sectors like steel production and cement production. Steel production, cement production, or even aviation, are those taken into account in the model?
Yeah, this is.
Go up so the people.
Yeah, sorry. If you wouldn't mind repeating the question.
Yeah, so the question was, how do we account for hard-to-abate sectors in the model and hard-to-abate applications? And we just have this diversity of energy carriers, so we assume that we're putting P2X into steel manufacturing, so that we can just substitute the inputs currently. So we use a lot of heat energy in steel production. We're going to get that heat energy from the P2X in this model. Same for aviation, we'll just use the P2X fuels. And we must point out that this is it's just an assumption. We're saying that we're going to keep some fuels in, some of these liquids and gases, but we don't need to. We're not saying that's going to happen. If we can electrify those uses and that's cheaper, then that will happen. We just didn't want to, we just wanted to kind of maintain a kind of pessimistic viewpoint where we could just substitute one fuel directly for something very equivalent. So hydrogen for natural gas, for example. And
house heating. Say about house heating.
Okay, yeah. But this is pessimistic because it costs a lot more to make P2X than to just use gas. So we're saying let's make all that P2X, this vast quantity up here, which is like gargantuan really. But we're saying that's probably cheaper. So household heating is another difficult sector. So the UK is a very different position to other countries because a lot of the heating is gas-based. But electrifying it will change you from an efficiency, a conversion efficiency of around maybe 80 to 90% if you're lucky with gas, to 1 times or 2 times or 3 times if you use a heat pump. So
I just wanted to stress one point, just to take house heating. We made a stupid assumption. We just assumed that we just use electric heating, very inefficient way to do it. But because electricity is so cheap, and because we've saved in all these other places, it still comes out okay. Of course, in reality, people are going to install ground source heat pumps when they can and do things in smarter ways. This model is really just, we're making worst case assumptions across the board, and it still comes out cheaper.
Can we make one clarification for the online audience? Not everyone understands P2X as an abbreviation.
Power to X. So we use power, electricity, to create X being some kind of gas or liquid fuel, hydrogen, ammonia, methane, methanol, etc.
I would just say with cement, the chemical process that produce CO2 is not in the model, but it is in our analysis of the emissions. So we include that in the emissions analysis.
Yeah, so there's a difference between direct emissions from things like cement production and the emissions from energy use in hard to abate sectors. We've got the energy use covered, but we're not accounting for the direct emissions in agriculture, in the energy model. Like they're in the emissions charts at the end to show what else needs to be done. We're just showing that in the energy system, if you're just talking about the energy that goes into these processes, we've got it covered.
Thank you. Could we ask an online question again, which is take your model back to the year 2000, use the data just till then, and then forecast forward. How far are we away from what we look like in 2020?
It's a great question.
I think, I think we do pretty good. We actually come out a little bit, this would be pessimistic. The world has done even better than what we would have gotten then. I mean, there's in 2010, we've been on a kind of plateau for a while. If you look actually at that curve, we were on a plateau, then from 2010 to 2020, we went down faster than the normal. Our view is take long-term historical averages. We don't want to get drawn into stories about China and Germany and blah, 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 blah. Let's just look at the long-term trends, because those are the most reliable things. So
I guess I didn't have an economic cycle in that model that said 2008 something big.
No, but 2008 doesn't affect this model very much, and doesn't affect energy that much in the end. But so the answer is we would have done pretty good. We would certainly do far better than anybody else. And as I showed in 2010, I did a lot better than most, even though that was a pessimistic forecast.
Can I just add one subtlety, which is that data only becomes available for technologies over time. And back in 2000, we didn't have data on electrolyzers, for example, like we have now. So there is this. So we are making probabilistic forecasts now. Had we made them in the past, they would have been, well, some technologies we couldn't have done, and other technologies, they would have been maybe wider, the probability distributions, because there would be more uncertainty about where they're going.
Yeah.
And we should point.
One message is society needs to collect more data in a more consistent way.
Well, another way to turn that on the head is that each year that we get more data, we get more confidence. Those distributions actually shrink.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and keep the conversation moving. Can I just take a question from the room again, please? Oops.
Yeah, thanks. So I have
Stand close together.
a clarifying question regarding the assumption of technologies being PV-like. So what went into that beyond the historic change in the costs associated with those technologies? What other kind of characteristics are considered?
When you, maybe just to clarify the question, when you say PV-like, you mean that the costs are dropping quickly? Or do you mean that we aren't distinguishing between the 20 different varieties of potential solar cells?
I know what you mean.
Okay. Right.
So we've divided technologies up into techs where the forecasts we use are flat and the forecasts we use are the Wrights Law distributions. How did we decide which is which?
Yes.
First of all, we've got very few technologies in the model compared to other models, but 5 of them, 3 fossil fuels and then 2 fossil fuel electricities, they're all based on fossil fuels. So we've got that really long time series data. There's no actual other reason that, there's no theoretical reason that we have for dividing them up between these 2 buckets. We're just looking at the data, and if you get into it, then there'll be something very interesting about the capital portion of the energy technology, like the capital requirements versus the ongoing fuel and maintenance requirements.
But let's state the key fact. Those 5 technologies didn't improve in 140 years. And so you could use Wright's Law with them, in which case it would just be flat. You would see no improvement. And the way in which the model wouldn't fit is that you'd have too much scatter in the prices. There is some mean reversion. There seems to be some stickiness in fossil fuels that keeps the price around a certain level. And that's the difference with the AR model that we used. Otherwise, we could have used Wright's Law. We would have just had a much bigger and unrealistically large uncertainty interval, and with a flat learning exponent.
People have tried to apply the learning curve to fossil fuels, and they haven't found evidence for it being a good model.
Yeah.
So that was, one of the considerations that we brought into it.
Can I pick up the next online question is about inclusion of an externality, the pricing of the cost of CO2. So either potentially the fossil fuels could get cheaper because you're using fewer of them, less of them, or you might find that you're building a model. But are you telling us there's no need to price out CO2 because of this approach?
Well, I mean, the key thing to achieve what we said is that we stay on the current deployment trends for another decade. And certainly it would help make sure that happens if we had, I mean, we're all in favor of a carbon tax. And it would help remove those last sticky bits that are a bit harder to drive out of the system because they have cost-effective things. And back to the question about,
is it flat, or are you seeing a rising CO2 price?
We haven't calculated what the implied CO2 price would be under different CO2 constraints and the cost of carbon, or social cost of carbon. And we're not saying that it's not required, or we're saying that that's a policy tool. We're not saying exactly how these scenarios are made to happen, whether they even need to be made to happen, or whether they can happen organically. But the policy tool could be some kind of CO2 price that is differential among sectors, so which could help support technologies in certain sectors to be driven down the learning curve, particularly electrolyzers and hydrogen as required. But yeah, we're not covering that. We're just doing the large case.
Can we say something about being more targeted in terms of where that investment goes?
Well,
it's usually your spiel.
Well, yeah, so let's do that. I wanted to answer one other question there, which was about could this drive the price of fossil fuels down? The answer is yes. Because if you reduce demand, I mean, there's a huge diversity in the costs of producing fossil fuels. So, the Saudis are producing it for a few dollars a barrel. And so as you drive the cost of electricity down and the cost of energy down in general, then you're driving out the more marginal shale oil and things like that. You still ultimately are going to have to compete with jet fuel supplied by Saudi oil sources and jet fuel supplied by P2X, and that's where the carbon tax becomes really critical to drive those out, stamp out those last things, which, okay, because we don't have a world where we just end up with lots of cheap energy. We actually want to get the carbon gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. We could actually have a cheaper version with that fast transition that actually has got a certain amount of gas or something in it that, that's possible, but it's not net zero.
Yeah, that's something to point out, is that we haven't optimized for cost here at all. We're just presenting kind of a bit, trying to kind of recalibrate the baseline of what these grand transitions cost overall. We're not saying any of them is cheaper than every other scenario out there.
Yeah. So Pete, I'm just trying to reflect the questions. We come back into the room again now. And Phil, I think you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you've been in this seminar series before, so you have got a very good told you so track record already. But in COP26, presumably the narrative will be very much about those IPCC scenarios and the assessment models. So I just wondered, is there something that you can now do to take outputs from your models and somehow feed them into the integrated assessment models? I'm thinking of Michael Oberstein now being here. Somehow, what would that take?
Can you just repeat for the online audience what Phil's asking, please?
Yeah, sure. Is there some way that we could take the outputs from our model and feed it into the integrated assessment models, which are being used in the IPCC discussions, COP26, etc.? We've had a bit of interaction with some IAM people already, but it's very difficult because they use point forecasts for a start. So all the models that do use the experience curve, endogenous learning, they just produce one number for the cost of each technology, and they're often not that well. They don't test them generally that much around the cost that they present.
I mean, I would say that certainly we could help them improve things by just giving more realistic learning curves for everything. I was at a meeting 8 or 10 years ago in Germany where one of these big integrated assessment models was being discussed, and they just kind of pulled out, okay, we'll put in this learning rate for oil and this learning rate for PV. They were like, they didn't seriously empirically ground the things they were doing. So that would help. I think the question is, the real challenge for them is to get all these feedback loops to actually work so that they can recreate what's happened in the past. Those models have typically never been back tested against any real data to see whether they can produce an effective out-of-sample forecast. And you have to have that discipline, in my view, to do anything sensible.
I've attempted in the past to try and change a modelling regime within an organisation here in the UK, and it's really not easy. You've got not only the modellers themselves, that whole group around that machine, but also the decision makers who understand how the model works to a degree that they're comfortable talking with it. So you've actually got to do an entire regime shift to change a model out and replace it with another. What we're attempting at the moment is one of the projects is just getting our cost curves into their integrated assessment model, because if you look through time, they have brought the costs down to make them closer to actual when the actual costs do decline. And lo and behold, it costs less and there's more renewables. So it begs
and you've got to get them to pull out all the arbitrary assumptions about not just floor costs, but there's typically assumptions about floors and how much deployment can happen for a given technology. So there's a lot of arbitrary stuff that you need to get them to get rid of.
Here's a fan online question. I recognise you're not picking winners, but the question is, which transformational change or technology have you missed that could actually come and...
So this is the time to talk about targeting. So Rupert has another paper from a while ago where we looked at the question of portfolio choice for technology investment. And because, in a standard finance Markowitz type portfolio investment, you make the assumption that your investments don't influence the prices of the things that you're investing in. And when that happens, then you really want to diversify your investments quite strongly. In contrast here, the only way you're going to make progress is to invest in something. And so that says that you need to concentrate your investments more. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket because you're not sure which basket's going to be the good one, but you don't want to put your eggs in baskets that are unlikely to succeed. So you want to spread your eggs across a few baskets and pick winners. You do have to pick winners. You should pick winners because we have lots of evidence now about what the likely winners will be. But you don't know exactly which one will be the winner. So you should take the technologies that are almost certain losers, like nuclear power, fossil fuels, get rid of them. Because they've had their chance, they didn't do it. Modular nuclear reactors, very bad idea, because you're starting up at a really high cost. And even if you can bring the cost down, finally get nuclear on a learning curve, you're starting very high and you're fighting an economy of scale that you're probably never going to surpass where renewables are now. So yes, you need to be targeted, but spread your bets around sensibly.
Are you picking any of the names from biosciences or some of the other technologies?
Well, so again, we're not saying you shouldn't invest in long-range investments. You should do some of that. You want to cast your seeds widely. There's surely things out there we haven't thought of. using past progress is a crappy way to do it, but it's still better than anything else. And so yeah, we still want basic research to find those technologies that aren't on the list yet. It just, if we wanted one other comment, you see, it takes a long time for a technology to reach deployment. There's a big difference between something in the lab and something that's being sold at scale. Solar energy has been going since the 50s. All the technologies in our portfolio have been around a long time and are up and so they're in time to deal with climate change. Those other technologies we need to develop, but they probably can't be deployed. Well, really, we need to deploy them in the next couple decades. We can't afford to, take moonshots on that right now.
I think Warren Buffett said it very succinctly, it's easier to shoot the horse than pick the winning car in the transition from horses to cars.
I'm not sure we favour the animal cruelty argument. Take another question from in the audience, please.
Just a quick sort of general question about the electricity prices. What were the assumptions around the electricity prices projected further down? Like, did we consider the mix of, like the energy change mix in terms of the generation, like your base load? Was it a decentralized electricity market or centralized electricity market? What were the assumptions?
So we're operating above that level, and that, but maybe I should let.
Yeah, we don't consider power markets or the structure of the markets that are being used at all. We're just considering like large basic technologies, solar, wind, bit of biopower, hydro, bit of nuclear as it phases out, that kind of thing. In combination with these, we've got a bunch of batteries on the system and a load of P2X that is being created. We've got investment costs for the electricity networks in there, and we scale those up with the size of the power system in place or the amount of electricity generated. So when we say electricity costs will fall, all we've done is taken the sum of all these costs and divided by how much energy is being delivered as final energy.
And whenever possible, we're using levelized costs where you take into account things like investment, depreciation, et cetera, to get as much as you can, though they don't always account for everything you need to account for, and then we bring in other factors. And whenever we've had to make an assumption about something we don't have very much past data for, like say grid costs, we just assume they'll be the same per megawatt that they are now, though in fact we think they'll get cheaper per megawatt.
And I've just switched the slide here so that we can see we've got the levelized cost of solar and the capacity costs of batteries. So these are our forecasts, and we just sum up the forecasts and divide by, so the forecasts for all the different electricity related technologies, which includes the batteries and the networks, and then we divide that by the amount of electricity that's being provided to get there.
And as Dan said earlier, we've taken many conservative assumptions. So we've chosen to deal with the intermittency problem using storage, which isn't the cheapest option. There's many other options, with transmission, demand flexibility and so forth, that we could have chosen that would have been cheaper.
You still come out cheap.
And still get the result.
Still get cheaper.
We've got vast quantities of batteries here.
Batteries and P2X. We have enough P2X to run the whole grid for a month. So the wind cannot blow, the sun might not shine globally for a month. We'd still be able to run the Earth for a month.
We got other problems with that.
Yeah.
I'm going to take another online question and paraphrase it. I already heard that you're talking about unabated energy, so obviously taking the carbon out is going to cost more, but the politician is going to see a learning curve and say, well, that learning curve will apply to direct air capture or some other magic unicorn type technology. How do we, again, clarify, what's feasible and why the learning curve can't be applied more universally?
So that's why I showed, if you might recall a slide with a histogram. You go back a little ways, slide with a histogram where I was looking at lots of different technologies. That analysis has thousands of different categories in it. okay, maybe high hundreds. And you know, most of them are in that center peak where they're not really improving very much. They're just kind of going along with their prices go along with inflation and aren't very different. And in the next slide there, you see the extreme heterogeneity just playing out another way. We're really taking advantage of that heterogeneity. So the fact that you can do it with one tech doesn't say anything about what you can do with another.
So there will be learning curves for many technologies, even probably direct air capture. There's some kind of learning curve going on.
It probably does have a good learning curve. We don't know yet. Once we have enough examples, then we can determine where it'll be.
I'm going alone here because I'm not the expert, but from what I see, I mean, Diane said there's a certain magic to these technologies that we don't really understand why some are better than others, but to my mind, there's some obvious ones. Modularity, I know, is not necessarily the cause, but it's a component. The solar panel can be on your watch or it can produce gigawatts of energy. That's a lot of flexibility. Popularity, yeah, and open to mass production. And direct air capture arguably doesn't have that. Nuclear doesn't. Carbon capture and storage struggles in those categories. But that's my own opinion.
I think we've got time for one more question in the room. And a gentleman over here.
Yes, thanks. So I have two questions. The first one is that how do you incorporate the cost of or loss of the stranded asset into the fossil fuel cost? And the second question is what is your implication of the current COVID-19 impact on your energy dynamics?
Okay. So, I mean,
would you mind just repeating that?
Yeah, so the first question is how do we deal with stranded assets? And the answer is we take advantage of the fact that there's a lot of turnover in energy system. Things don't last forever, you know. Gas stations need to be replaced. We looked up all these data, you know, every 20 to 30 years. So if we're going to make a transition in 20 years, that gives us time to replace gas stations with, you know, electricity charging stations. So across the board, everything has a finite lifetime. And between the fact that we're assuming that 2% per year growth, that's the other thing that gives us a lot of latitude, because in addition to the fact that we're replacing what's already there, everything's growing at 2% per year. So that gives more opportunities to change the fractional composition through time. And yeah, it works out. Some assets will get stranded, but you know, it's still cheaper. It's cheaper to strand them than not. I mean, one of the nice statistics, Rupert fine-tuned this statement if I said it wrong, but by, was it 2040 or 2050, we predict that it's going to be cheaper to replace an operating plant just for the operating cost with a solar plant or the solar farm than it is to keep operating the plant.
More like 2027.
20, okay.
There was a second question, but does anyone remember what it was?
Oh, the second question was COVID-19. So COVID-19, you know, I've written 5 papers now on COVID-19. And COVID-19 is probably, you know, overall it's a bump. It's a very steep bump. We did a good job of predicting the bump. The long-term consequences are not obviously, they're first of all hard to forecast. I don't think they're very big, and I think on the timescales we're talking about here, I don't think it's relevant.
The more depressing component, I don't know if you've seen Cameron Hepburn's paper on it, but the work that they're doing to work out to what extent the stimulus packages include green spending, and it's a little bit depressing to see how small an amount, how small a percentage of those stimulus packages are investing in these technologies. And that's going to be a huge amount of money that's going to get invested over the next decade that won't have more money to spend on this if we don't spend that stimulus package on this. So,
no, I mean, we're fighting incumbents. The price supports for fossil fuels and nuclear power exceed those for solar energy by a good amount. And so got to, you know, get rid of these incumbent advantages that are handicapping renewables.
Okay, I think I'm going to come in. I think we're going to have to wrap up. I'm sure we couldn't get to all of the questions, but can you virtually and also physically again join and thank Matt, Rupert and Doyne again for fascinating insight this afternoon. I think in the chat you will have seen details of signing up for future talks in this seminar series, and join us again same time next Tuesday. It's 4:30 because it's online only. Yeah, and we'll be looking at India, which again is quite timely because of the cold stocks currently running out there. I hope you'll be able to join us. Thanks again for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you. So the slide has just come up. It's hard to discern whether the financial crisis you are putting out there.